Minutes. Just waiting for the countdown. Looks like we're good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Low Budget Interview Show. I'm your host, Eric Smith, and with me today is an author. He's an editor. He might be a figment of imagination. It's Jonathan Raab.
Yeah, I'm not a figment of your imagination, but I might be a psychological warfare operation for sure. So keep that in mind.
That's the kind of thing I want to hear. All right, so I always put everybody on the spot first thing. If you had to write your author bio right now, what would it say?
So I'm a hack horror writer living in Colorado. I like to specialize in meta media horror and short stories and novels with themes of social isolation and institutional decay, and a sense that not only are things going wrong, things are going wrong by design. How's that work?
Some lighthearted.
Light and fluffy stuff. Yeah, I say all that stuff and I mean it. And my writing has a lot of like serious, heavy stuff going on it. And, I've obviously got those themes in mind, but I will assure you, if you pick up one of my books or one of my stories, it'll be a fun read. It'll be the equivalent of going through an old rickety, dangerous spook house ride while someone is like reading, French philosophy in the background. You can pay attention to that if you want, and you'll get something out of it. But if you just want to enjoy the ghosts and the spooks and the aliens who are popping up to scare you, you're going to enjoy it just as much.
I can see that. That's a great description.
Yeah.
So I had sort of this whole thing planned out, as much as I plan any of this, but I re-listened to your interview with Max Booth on Ghoulish, and everything went out the window because I have to ask, why are you on Twitter ragging on Star Wars?
So I think I said I was shit posting about Star Wars. I actually love Star Wars. It's one of my many moral failings. I even like some of the prequel stuff. I'm not like a hardcore prequel defender, but there's stuff I like about The Phantom Menace. There's a lot I like about Attack of the Clones. And Revenge of the Sith is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, period. I like the sequels, even though they're kind of a mess. I will acknowledge that. I like the animated shows. I tell people if they like Star Wars, I always ask them, have you seen the Clone Wars show? It's really good. Even though it's for 12-year-old boys, it's still really good, if you keep that in mind. So I am a bit of a Star Wars fanatic, unfortunately. And that's like not cool in the independent horror literature online scene at all to admit, but I do like Star Wars, yes.
Do you read, or have you read any of the novels or the comics or any of that stuff?
Yeah, occasionally I will. I've read a couple of the new novels in the new Disney canon. Alphabet Squadron is probably the best one I've read. It's like, because I always like the dogfight stuff, the starfighter combat stuff. I've read a couple other ones. I used to read the old EU stuff back when I was in high school. That stuff's kind of a mixed bag.
Oh yeah.
But I've read a few of the comics as well. I was just reading Rise of Kylo Ren in trade paperback online through the library.
I hear that's a very good one.
It is very good, and I'm not someone who hates the sequels by any measure. I actually enjoyed them quite a bit. But one of my complaints about them is that they don't have enough backstory as to what's going on exactly, and I felt like what happens in that comic probably should have been referenced a little bit more in The Force Awakens. I think it would have made for a better holistic picture to help us figure out who Kylo Ren really is, and what went on with him and Luke. So
I'm excited. There's a Dr. Aphra book that was supposed to be out on Tuesday. Hopefully it is, and it's actually a script, or the script of an audiobook.
Yes.
And I'm I think she's my favorite character created in the comics. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but I'm a huge Dr. Aphra fan, so I'm looking forward to picking that up.
Yeah, I haven't read anything with her in it yet, but every time I hear someone talking about it, it's always pretty positive. So we'll have to check it out. I like when Star Wars gets kind of weird and niche, and it's not always the grand epic cosmic struggle between good and evil. I like it when it's like just a single character, I think she's like an archaeologist or something, right? So
like an amoral Indiana Jones, with, in her first series anyway, she had the two psychotic robots as companions.
Okay.
Basically, evil versions of R2D2 and C3PO.
Okay.
So
Shades of HK-47 from the old Knights of the Old Republic.
I'm not super familiar with all the Knights of the Old Republic stuff.
Okay.
I read the whole Rogue Squadron series because I love the dogfights, and X-Wings are one of my favorite ships in any science fiction. And I have the two horror novels. I enjoyed both of those. And then some Darth Maul stuff. But there's a lot of the old stuff I have not read.
Sure. It's of mixed quality. Some of it's pretty good, and I think people get upset about Disney sort of waving the magic wand and getting rid of a lot of it. But watching The Mandalorian, every other new thing in that is pulled out of the EU. So like I'm actually someone who's like, actually the EU is more alive today than it was under George Lucas, because he didn't really pay attention to any of that stuff. And if you listen to Dave Filoni talk about it, he was like, George was always like, it's the 6 movies and the 2 TV shows, and like that's it. So it's interesting to see a lot of that stuff crop up, from the old games to the old books, to be put into live action. It's pretty cool. So I'm sure this is what your audience is tuned in for, to hear us do Star Wars chat on a horror podcast. So apologize if I'm not watching this.
I wouldn't say it's a horror. It's just like I said, it's conversation. So, and I was going to say, I suppose last thing, Star Wars. I think there were 2 MedStar books. I can't remember if that's what it was called. It's kind of like MASH in the Star Wars universe.
Okay, yeah.
And I always thought that would be a great show on Disney Plus or whatever.
That would be interesting, and I like when Star Wars presses up against the limits of what, it's a franchise with war in the title, right? So it's always refreshing when, in Last Jedi they talk about weapons manufacturers, and then in The Mandalorian they have an ex-stormtrooper who is presented as, an ex-sniper, Imperial soldier, who's presented as like kind of an asshole. He's a bad guy, but when we meet up with him again in season 2, we realize he's actually traumatized by his service, and he's got mixed feelings about it, and he's at the point in his life where he's realizing all the propaganda he's been fed, it isn't true, and the thing he's devoted his life to has like ruined him. And there's a good moment of payoff in that. But, it's been a while. I think I could probably spoil it, but like he murders an Imperial officer, sort of like basically just in the heat of the moment.
Right.
Yeah. That's a really cool moment, because it's very easy to say, oh, this is just silly space opera serial stuff inspired by 1930s space opera, which it is. But it's always nice when they acknowledge a little bit. It's like, actually the violence and the systems of violence in these that we're portraying, are analogous to real world conflicts, and there's victims of it, and they're not all just faceless extras, So
I do feel that the Disney stuff feels more like war. You had the giant space battles in the older things, but and the ground battle on Hoth, but in the new trilogy and the Mandalorian, it felt like war. It was gritty, it was dirty. It really seemed to, for lack of a better term, when we're talking about Star Wars, it felt more realistic, the war part.
Yeah, Rogue One especially is excellent about that. And they get it, and I'm looking forward to the Cassian Andor show, because I think it's just going to be all him just icing dudes and like doing dirty stuff. Because he talks about it in Rogue One, and he's like, you don't know what I've done, like what we've all done for the rebellion. This is our lives, and he's basically implying we've thrown away our lives in service of these ideals, and we've done evil things. And you see that a little bit in the beginning, where he just kills his contact because the contact is mildly at risk at being picked up by stormtroopers, so he just murders him. So I'm interested to see where they go with that show. I don't want it to get too dark. I don't want it to be totally grimdark, but I like when they show that it's not all just happy endings, and if we just believe in ourselves well enough, or if I believe in my dad enough, he'll save the day. And that's not a shade against Return of the Jedi. I love Return of the Jedi, but yeah. So,
all right. So my first real question: I feel like this is something you're probably asked a lot. I could be wrong about that, but what is high strange?
Yeah, so high strange is not a term I've invented or anything. I'm not sure who did, but basically it's a catch-all term for sort of Forteana, like, or strange paranormal events that are sort of inexplicable and that go beyond, in most cases, just like simple classifications of things that you might think about discrete classifications of like unsolved mysteries. Well, this is a ghost story. This is an alien abduction story. High strange tends to be an amalgamation of several different events that seemingly all have contradictory um, motivations, explanations, or presentations. The best example I can give that most people might have some familiarity with would be the sort of the Mothman prophecies incident in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. John Keel wrote a great book on it, which I recommend. And the movie's actually pretty good too with Richard Gere. It kind of got ignored when it came out, but it's actually a pretty good movie. So high strange tends to be strange paranormal events that have a much deeper, sometimes sinister, sometimes prophetic, highly weird resonance. So it's not just, oh, I saw a ghost in the house. It's, I saw a ghost in the house. The ghost changed shape, appeared in multiple forms over the course of several weeks or months, predicted things that came true, and then offered me pancakes when his buddies in the UFO landed in the front lawn. And then the people in the UFO weren't aliens. They actually said that they were fairies and they're from the subterranean hollow earth, right? You start stacking all of these very weird, hard to define events on top of each other. So there tends to be a broader resonance with the events. They tend to go beyond just like a single isolated incident, and they tend to defy what we might think of as typical categorization of paranormal events. So wherever you might see Sasquatch, like, oh yeah, there's Sasquatch in these woods, right? So you hear about this a lot of times in like remote rural areas, very frequently at like Native American reservations. Places in the mountains, like here in Colorado, sometimes people have sightings. It's not just Sasquatch, it's also the UFO, it's also the spook lights, it's also missing time and tricksterism, right? So there seems to be some force or entity or series of forces and entities that are playing with the rules of reality in a way that can't just be easily explained as, oh, it's aliens from another planet coming here to do medical inspections on us. Like it's much deeper than that and much stranger and much weirder, and it's probably impossible to actually like define. So you have a catch-all term like high strange to wrap up these transcendent, extra human, not non-human intelligent driven experiences. So I probably confused the matter more than I cleared it up with that answer, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's a grab bag of anything you can think of and a bunch of things you can't think of.
So, do you think X-Files falls into that category?
Some episodes do. Typically they're pretty straightforward, right? A lot of episodes like, oh, this is a ghost, this is a fish man living in the sewer or whatever, this is a guy who can stretch through vents and murders people and eats their liver. There's always there's typically in that show a material explanation, right? These things exist within material reality and they're different, and we don't have a scientific classification for them yet, but we could if we had enough information. There are a few episodes where it goes beyond that, and the best example is an episode called Jose Chung's From Outer Space.
Exactly the one I was thinking of.
That is a high strange episode because it starts with an alien abduction, and it turns out the aliens are actually American soldiers doing psychological warfare on their own citizens, and then a real UFO shows up, and then the creature that beams down from the UFO isn't from outer space. He's from, I think, the inner Earth or the core of the Earth or something, Mumbutu or something. I can't remember what his name is. And then Jesse Ventura and Alex Trebek show up playing themselves or something playing Jesse Ventura and Alex Trebek. That's high strange.
That is the exact episode that I was thinking of.
Yes.
I
Yes.
couldn't remember the full title. I knew it was Jose Chang.
I think it's Chung. Jose Chung's from Outer
Chung. Jose. I
Space.
knew it was Jose Chung. I couldn't remember the whole thing, but yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Is
Yeah,
that
and
particular
they're taking a shot at Whitley Strieber there with the cover of the book that Scully's reading at some point.
an author I've met?
Oh, you've met him. Oh, I'm curious. He's a guy that fascinates me. I'd like to hear your story of how you met
He,
him.
well, it wasn't. I didn't get to interview him or anything. He was actually doing a reading at our local Borders, which will tell you how long ago that was. And I did get him to sign a copy of Communion for me.
Nice. That's an excellent book. I've read it two or three times, and it scares the hell out of me every time. So,
Only read it
it,
the one time.
yeah, it's good. Yeah, I've read some of his later stuff. It gets, it's sort of diminishing returns. I think it's mostly him like getting older and reflecting on it and trying to find something new to say about it, and then trying to like reflect on it and come up with new explanations. And I don't think they'll work, to be honest. Like I read some of it, some of his latter stuff, and it doesn't quite jive with the sense of like awe and wonder and terror of the first book or the first couple books. I think that's where that stuff really worked. And he's a guy I find very interesting because I absolutely do not think he is lying. I don't think he is. I don't think what he writes about or what is presented is necessarily 100% accurate, but I don't think he's a huckster. He doesn't strike me as that. He's too far into this. Does that make sense?
But he believes it's true.
Yes,
He's
yes,
not
yes.
trying to fool anybody.
Yeah, yeah.
He's trying to.
Yeah, he experienced something traumatic, and I'm not sure what it was, but I'm open to the possibility. But I would say Communion is an example of high strange because he talks about the possibility that these are aliens or extraterrestrials, but then he goes into other possibilities of what they could be. And they seem, and a point he emphasizes in his early books is that they could possibly have a spiritual mission, right? There's a spiritual aspect and dimension to the interactions with them. And again, that is high strange to me because that goes beyond the material explanation of, oh, they're just people from a different planet doing medical examinations. Like those are having a spiritual mission and message is very different from I want to see, how your insides work. Like those are two very different things. So
how did you get into this whole high strange thing?
So I grew up in a place, and I've actually never reliably had an experience myself. I'm actually a highly skeptical person when it comes to UFOs or ghosts or anything else. I think 99% of the time it's just going to be like, I don't know, if there's bad wiring in the basement, you can have a paranormal experience, right? Because your brain is being affected by the environment. That's probably what's going on in most cases. Or you're tired, or you misinterpret an event and you misremember, and then you bring your cultural expectations and understanding to something, and then you change the memory. That's probably what's going on. But I grew up in a place where a lot of the very sober, serious-minded adults who were not interested in science fiction really or fantasy, people like my grandmother, a devout Catholic all her life, who the last conversation I had with her, a year before she died, was about how flying saucers would buzz the farm, the same place I would end up growing up on. My buddy's dad was on his way to a party and saw a big, slow-moving ball of fire move quietly over the forest, over his truck, and then disappear. I've got friends who have seen, the stereotypical black triangle, like hovering anti-grav aircraft that people describe all the time. So I come from a place where stories about that stuff was around me all the time, but it wasn't ever like treated as like something really. Like it wasn't something to be made fun of, and it wasn't something that was all that remarkable because so many people had a story like that. So I'm sure that was working on me. And then I was pretty young when shows like The X-Files came out initially. So the cultural zeitgeist of the idea of the flying saucer, and then the gray and the abduction, and late 80s, early 90s era government conspiracy theories, with things like, Behold a Pale Horse coming out as a book. That stuff was definitely in the cultural soup. And as a kid, I was always drawn to ideas of the fantastic, whether they were fictional, right, Star Wars, or whether they were presented as possibly nonfiction. Like, my library had a collection of books on Sasquatch or the Loch Ness Monster, flying saucers, that type of thing. So just being a weird kid growing up in the right place at the right time, I guess I zeroed in on it. And then as I got older, I started reading, the more serious-minded literature, getting into writers like Whitley Strieber or John Keel, or reading a random UFO book, that I would find at the library or a used bookstore, and then just sort of getting into it and listening to podcasts and sort of keeping up with it. So I've always kind of had an interest in it, and as a horror writer, getting into horror writing seriously, probably in college. I started by aping Lovecraft and other King, and you should copy people that you like. That's how you should get started. It's a good method, and then realizing, okay, as I'm developing my own voice, what do I want to bring to the table? Well, high strange, paranormal, ufological events, literature, shows. Those things scare me in a very like serious existential way. So why not bring those ideas and those tropes and those signifiers to horror fiction? And I think it's worked out well so far.
I would agree from what I've read of your stuff. Before we get to your stuff specifically, you mentioned you've read some Star Wars comics. Are you generally a comic book reader?
Off and on. Used to be more a few years ago, being sort of single and having some disposable income. I'd go to the comic book shop every couple weeks or something. I haven't read anything like on a monthly basis in probably a few years, and that's more out of just having to pay for diapers and a mortgage and stuff like that. So,
have you heard of a book called the Department of Truth?
I have not. No, this will be the first time.
I'm gonna pimp someone else's product here.
Okay.
This is the first volume, and this is. I'm just gonna read the back. It's just easier than me trying to explain it here.
Sure.
So this is the premise, obviously. Cole Turner has studied conspiracies all his life, from flat Earth theory and the assassination of JFK to modern day crisis actors, but he isn't prepared to live in a world where collective belief can turn fringe theories into reality. This is the terrible secret revealed to Cole when he is inducted into the Department of Truth, a top secret branch of the American government that has been tasked for generations with making sure dangerous conspiracies don't gain a foothold in the real world. But as Cole pulls back the curtain on everything he ever accepted as fact, he must ask himself whether this mysterious department is a force for good, or if it has more sinister reasons for wanting to control the truth.
Yeah, spoiler alert, it probably does, right? So that sounds cool,
know.
Man.
By the end of this volume, don't know. And once I reached out to you about doing this interview, I made sure to read this because, again, your writing and the things you've talked about sort of seem to fit. And I would recommend it. If it's really, really interesting. There's an overarching, this is, I think, 5 issues, 1 through 5. And of course, there's an overarching story, but each issue seems to specifically focus on a different conspiracy that is sort of becoming reality because of the belief of people.
Yeah, that sounds very much close to home to what's going on in the country right now, for sure. So that's interesting to me. What year did it come out? When did it come out?
This volume just came out.
Okay.
I think issue 7. It's one of the books I get a few monthly books, and then a lot of stuff I get in the collected editions.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I think issue 6 or 7 just came out, the monthly issue, but this collection just came out a few weeks ago.
So it's probably recent, and the reason I ask is I'm wondering if the author is engaging with the last few years in this country and how conspiracy theory is manifested.
Well, the 3rd issue in here, which is my favorite one, deals with crisis actors and a woman who her son was killed in a school shooting. Mm-hmm. And she's being hounded by people that are calling her crisis actor, calling it all fake, and then she sent a video that actually shows her taking improv classes, learning what to say after her son has been shot. And so now she's starting to believe that her son is really alive. It's wild.
That sounds very creepy and interesting, and I think I'll check that out, see if my library's got it. And I would be curious to how they handled that, because you have to handle that pretty delicately, I would think, in order to get that right. I wrote a book called The Hillbilly Moonshine Massacre a few years ago, and one of the influences of when I got really deep into listening to paranormal and conspiracy theory podcasts and YouTube channels, like individual guys in their basement, like recording videos with like news clips and stuff, and interpreting it. And I had to stop because I was like, okay, I've got enough of this absorbed into my psyche to write in this mode, because I think I understand where this is going. But I had to stop because it had such a negative effect on me psychologically. Like, there were things in it that there were broad patterns that I would agree with. Like, yeah, I think this country's going in a bad direction. And yeah, probably corporations and the government don't have your best interests at heart. I can agree with that. But I would frequently, and it was surprising how easy it would be to stumble into that message being refracted. Actually, it's this group of people's fault. And this group of people, they almost always end up being a minority group of some sort. Right. And that wasn't everybody saying that, and that wasn't like always the message, but like, it was creepy how YouTube would direct me towards this type of stuff. Or if I'm reading blog content, how frequently it would sort of blend into, actually it's this group of people's fault. And it wasn't like the ruling class. It was like, oh, it's this minority group's fault, or there's this agenda from this group. And it was very destructive and very disturbing to see that type of thing, to the point where at the back of the book, when I wrote it, I said, here's a bunch of stuff that I read and listened to and watched in preparation for this book. And I actually listed like Alex Jones on there, because I had listened to him for about 9 months. I was like, this is crazy. This is kind of where one of the characters' voice is coming from. And then subsequently things like, the big election around that time, 2015, 2016. And I saw this movement towards like nationalism and white supremacy and religious justification for the persecution of minorities in this country and elsewhere. And I went back and I looked at this, I said, oh my God, what have I done? And I actually removed that page that was at the back of the book that said, here's all these things I listened to. And some of them were innocuous. They weren't, they were like UFO podcasts or stuff. But I realized that soup that I was like going to for fun and going to for, research purposes could have on a mass scale a very negative effect on people. And I think it did. And I think to a certain degree, forgive me, I don't know your politics, but one of my social theories about the election of our former president is that he was a reality show television character that was manifested into reality through collective will. Like, that's essentially what happened, right? Like, he was a fictional character that so many people decided to believe in him, despite most of the things he said as being transparent lies. They invested that and imbued that with such power and belief that he became president of the United States. And he became a person who dominated the thoughts and thinking of everybody in this country and across the world for 5 years, right? So I like conspiracy theories, right? And I like, the meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's like working in the mailroom and he's figuring out who Pepe Silva is or whatever. Like, that stuff's all fun. And like, I can laugh at an Alex Jones meme, but the reality is that that some of that stuff can be very, very destructive, like on a personal level and on a like sort of a macro social level. And I think the big irony of me saying that is that sometimes it's very easy, because what I just said is true. It's very easy for authorities to use the term conspiracy theory as a cudgel and say, oh, well, you're a conspiracy theorist, or, we need to get back to facts. So we're going to go to our corporate controlled, corporate owned media outlet that's got a fact checker now. And he's going to fact check people who want to reform the system and make our country better. Actually, those people are just like Donald Trump. Those people are just like Alex Jones. And I became very frustrated with feeling like there's often like nowhere to go, because if you go too far off the deep end, you're going to end up in a situation where you're manifesting a Tulpa reality show character to become president of the United States, versus you've got news stories in the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN or wherever, where basically they're just recycling and regurgitating talking points from the State Department whenever they're talking about a problem, or hey, we've got this former director of the CIA on this panel to talk about Black Lives Matter. Excuse me, what the fuck? What do those two things have to do with each other? I feel trapped sometimes in this. I feel like not to equate everything or say that we're one side is just as bad as the other, or that these are even two well-defined sides, because they're not. But I love conspiracy theories and ufological works and paranormal stuff and alternative countercultural media and messaging, but I see the horror that can lead to unfettered. But I can also see the horror that centralized fact-based journalism can lead to. Fact-based journalism, consensus, status quo, listening to the smartest people in the room got us into the Iraq War, right? Which is the absolute probably worst #1 atrocity of my lifetime. What, a million dead Iraqis, civilians, right? And I wore the uniform of the United States during that period. I didn't serve in Iraq. I've got plenty of friends who did. So when I say that, I feel like I know what I'm talking about. So I feel very frightened sometimes in terms of the information that is presented to us and that we consume, either knowingly and willingly, understanding where it's coming from, understanding its bias and perspective, and sometimes not. Conspiracy theory, language, memes, and patterns that I saw back in 2014, 2015 in doing research for my silly conspiracy theory fiction book, right? Which is the equivalent of like a comic book from my perspective in terms of like tone and seriousness. I started to see my older aunts and uncles share that exact same time of material, like mimetic material on social media. Or someone will text me, hey, did you see that your uncle or aunt posted this on Facebook? And I'm like, I recognize where that came from 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So I like to talk about that stuff, and I'm sorry if I got a little too serious there, but like,
no, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I like to talk about this stuff, and I like to write about this stuff, but like, I do want to recognize that there's a cost and there's a downside, and there's human collateral, I think, sometimes to this sort of thing. Like the crisis actor scene that you described to me, it seems very resonant because that crisis actor idea has ruined the lives of people who are like suffering, like actually suffering. Does that make sense?
Right. Oh yeah.
So all this to say, the comic book sounds very interesting. I'll check it out. But when dealing with those topics, you have to be extremely careful, I think.
To go back a moment, when you were talking about a certain reality show host being manifested, I was going to ask you if that was a tulpa kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then you threw that out there.
How can it not be? How can it not be? A figure purely of our collective consciousness that enough people got behind and said, this is true, this is real, I support this. Like, in no sane order reading of history was that going to be an outcome, right? And the fact that it was, I think, points to the fact that we probably don't live in a sane and ordered world that can be read in such a way. Anyone trying to read it in such a way is failing at history.
And excuse me, I've always been fascinated with conspiracies. Years, I don't even remember how long ago, I read a book, The 50 Greatest Conspiracies of All Time. Unfortunately, shortly after I read it, a new edition came out, 75 Greatest Conspiracies of All Time. I think they might be up to 100. But there's a couple publishers who have what they call their pop culture and philosophy library, which I have a bunch of books in both of their series. But one of those publishers has a book called Conspiracies. And then the subtitle is something about the philosophy of conspiracies or something. Mm-hmm. and it not only talks about why people believe them and how they form and things, but the dangers of conspiracies and believing certain conspiracies.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a great book. It was, and it as opposed to the 50 greatest conspiracies just told you what they were. This again is kind of a philosophy book and gets into what they are and how they work and what they do.
Yeah, I think often, especially with Q being the most recent example, although I'm not sure what the election of Joe Biden is going to have on that particular subset going forward, but I would be interested to find out. Is a form of like sort of like Christianized magical thinking, right? It's a response to, I think, real most conspiracies theories are a response to, if they're not true, if they're not valid, because some are, like, I do happen to think the CIA had something to do with selling crack cocaine in American cities. There's enough evidence to back that up. I think it's probably true. The justification for the Vietnam War, Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? That was manufactured. The Iraq War, the evidence presented to the world to justify an invasion, that was a conspiracy. It's all pretty much in the public record. We understand what it is. U.S. government collusion with Saudi military and intelligence forces leading up to the event of 9/11. Not to say it was an inside job, I'm not saying that, but the idea that we didn't have some idea what was coming, or we didn't know who was responsible and decided to blame someone else anyway. Those are all things that I think are generally demonstrably true. But the more wacky, crazy, sinister stuff that people get into, I think, as dangerous as it can be and as negative as it can be, and I do want to acknowledge that, is often a response to very real social anxieties and factors that are legitimate issues, right? Now, if you are economically precarious your whole life and you've had nothing but dead-end job after dead-end job, you've probably been experienced periods of malnutrition, there's lead in the pipes, you've been around violence your whole life or drug use, domestic abuse, you don't have access to medical services, let alone psychological counseling services, you might get the sense that there's people out there to get you. Because your entire life, actually, people have been out to get you. So what you do is you take that general idea, which is real, it's true, and then you refract it around the idea of lizard people control the government. The reason things are so bad in America is because lizard people run everything, and they want us to be miserable because they're harvesting our adrenochrome or whatever, right? So like, they often start from very real problems that people's thinking, their ideology, their systems of thinking, the religion does not allow them to see what the systemic issues are in a very real sense. So they have to manufacture fantasy explanations. I live in the greatest country in the world. There's no reason things are this bad in my life and for the life of everyone, in the lives of everyone else I love, unless there was a sinister group at the top trying to pull the strings to make my life miserable, right? And that's where I think like things like Q or like reactionary conservatism, conspiracy theory thinking comes from. Does that make sense?
There has to be someone to blame.
Yes.
Someone or something.
Right, and I think there are things to blame, and I think there are steps we could take to make things better, but because of our ideological conditioning, we're not allowed to think in those terms. We're only allowed to think in terms of, oh, it's the immigrants, or it's the liberal gay agenda, or whatever, right? You're going to blame vulnerable people, because that's a trick that's always worked. It's always worked throughout history. Rulers realize, hey, I don't actually want to invest to fix the problems that I myself have created or am refusing to act upon, so we'll just blame this powerless group, and that'll get people all riled up, and it's very effective.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately.
Do you read F. Paul Wilson?
No, I've not read F. Paul Wilson. That's a name I've heard many times, though. So.
I'm actually doing a video series reading through his Secret History books, but he's got a whole Repairman Jack series, and one of them, looking up, I can't see which one. One of the early books in the Repairman Jack series is just called Conspiracies, and the character goes to a conspiracy theory convention. It's one of my favorites in the series so far because, again, love reading about conspiracies. It's not as deep and serious. I mean, it's not lighthearted, but it is fun to read about some of the things. And I'm familiar. I think everything that was mentioned in there by the people at this convention were theories that I had heard. But there was a lot of Hollow Earth and lizard people and microchips and
Sure, sure.
all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, some of it is totally okay to get into. Like if I met someone and they're like, I'm really into Hollow Earth theory, like that's probably not a red flag. Do you know what I mean? Or like, hey, I think the Nazis built a moon base back in the 40s. Like, okay, like that's pretty harmless. It's when you get into the other stuff that's like, hey, they're sacrificing babies under a pizza parlor, in Manhattan. That's when, and I want to take action about it. There's a spectrum here, it almost breaks my heart to see it sort of weaponized in a very like obvious and like often racist or reactionary way to see these things like moved into that space more prominently. And I guess if I'm being honest, there would be people who would point out, hey, that realm has always been negative. There's always that darkness there. But I do get a kick out of Sasquatch sightings, and I do get a kick out of like people talking about actually the government knows all about UFOs and they've got these secret programs, and like I am interested in that stuff. It's just when when I'm reading Behold a Pale Horse, and in the middle of the book he's got, oh, by the way, there's this book called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or whatever, and it's all about the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, but it's not actually about the Jews. Just replace it with Illuminati. And I'm like, oh God, I can't read this. I'm not going to read this. Like you're taking me down the dark path, man. I don't want to go there. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. Let's talk about some of your stuff here.
Sure.
And
now that I've alienated most of the audience here.
So. Oh, you didn't alienate me. That's all that matters.
Okay, great.
This just arrived in the mail today.
Mm-hmm.
Right there. And I'm curious. It says on the copyright page, editing and layout by Jonathan Raab.
That's me.
Nothing on the cover.
So I've had people criticize that before. I just feel weird about that. I've always just felt weird because it's like I don't want to like put myself front and center in those projects. Does that make sense? But I've had people say actually it's like it's a faux pas not to put it on the cover because you should put it on the cover. But
I have no feelings about one way or the other. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Although I have a list of every book I've read since 1985.
Okay.
And so I just after I finish a book, I put the title and I put the author. And usually with something like this, I would put the title and then edit it by Jonathan Raab, because I'm not going to list every single author that's in it. So am I allowed to do that? Would you prefer I left that?
Yeah, no. I mean, that's a book I'm very proud of. Like, it's probably the best anthology I've helped put together. It's got a beautiful cover art by Trevor Henderson.
Love that guy.
Yeah. So it's a book I'm very proud of. So yes, I'd be very proud to make your list of books since 1985 with names next to it. Yeah, put my name next to it. That'd be great.
I'm definitely looking forward to reading that. I like the idea of the inspiration, what it's from. Now, would you call these novelizations of movies that don't exist, or just stories inspired by those movies?
Yeah, so Behold the Undead of Dracula specifically is a response to sort of my late coming fandom to the Hammer horror period, sort of the Gothic revival movement, right? So I would also include the Roger Corman, Vincent Price Poe stuff with some Lovecraft sprinkled in there. Mario Bava, right? So the continental and some of the American film resurgence of the 50s, probably through the 50s through the mid 70s, depending on where you start and stop, where Gothic horror was big again, right? It's been 20 years since the Universal movies, and then audiences were discovering that they actually still really like creaky vampire movies and the classic monsters and foreboding Gothic manners, and people wearing like puffy shirts and walking around, and it sounds like they should be quoting Shakespeare, but the production really isn't that highbrow. But they could be quoting Shakespeare. And actually, Vincent Price was a Shakespearean actor, by the way, very accomplished one as well. Just as an aside, but I really like that period of horror because it is gesturing toward an idealized horror movie past that doesn't really actually exist. And I think I actually enjoy the Hammer movies more than I enjoy the original Universal stuff. And that's just sort of a matter of taste. And that's not to say I don't like the Universal stuff, but that period of the 50s through the early 70s is sort of like the sunset period of that type of horror. Even though they had some nudity in the later films and they played up the sex appeal and there was actually blood on screen in those, they were still extremely quaint and very very almost safe in light of what was to come, specifically with Night of the Living Dead and then Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? And everything else that would come out of the late 60s and move into the early 70s, especially out of the United States, changing what horror movies were. They were no longer just the safe vampire in the castle, and as long as you don't go to the castle, you're okay. Now the horror is in your backyard, quite literally. It's your neighbors, it's your family, right? It's the people who should be helping you because you ran out of gas, but they want to eat you and barbecue. They want to barbecue you and serve you at their roadside diner or whatever. So I admire that almost safety, that comfort, that warm fuzziness that those types of horror movies had. So I was inspired to put together the anthology, and I was lucky enough that there's plenty of talented writers in that book that likewise love that era of movie making. They love the Hammer movies, they love the Vincent Price stuff. And I feel like all the stories in there are extremely representative of movies that could have been made. There's some meta stuff in there where a couple of them are actually about the making of those types of movies, and things go awry very quickly. Or some of them are just inspired by tonally or thematically things that were going on, or things that were being explored in those films.
All right, great. Well, as I said, I'm very much looking forward to it. But let's talk about some of the stuff I have read. And first of all, you might want to give a kickback to Max Booth, because it was hearing you on his podcast that got me to pick some of this stuff up. The first thing I read was in Dark Moon Digest.
Yep.
And this is Hunting Them Hills with Joel and Big Howie.
Mm-hmm.
I did misidentify it when I reviewed one of your books. I said it was a YouTube show, but it was cable access.
Public access.
Yeah. So I apologize for that.
No problem.
So I read that, and then I was very excited about Camp Ghoul Mountain Part 6.
Mm-hmm.
The official novelization.
That's right.
And I love these covers. And then, of course, I just recently read and reviewed The Crypt of Blood.
Yes,
Halloween TV special, another fantastic cover.
Also by Trevor Henderson.
Oh, same author or artist? Excuse me.
The artist for Camp Ghoul Mountain was a colleague of the editor's. His name escapes me at the moment, but that could easily be a movie poster. But Trevor's done a few book covers. He did Behold the Undead of Dracula, Crypt of Blood, and he actually also did the cover for my new collection as well. I don't know if that's showing up or not. Nope, it's disappearing. That's all right.
Got a little peek at it. But there seems to be a thread. I don't know if that's the proper term. Essentially, you have a cable access or a public access show, and then a novelization of a movie, and then a made-for-TV special movie. And what happens around those things.
Mm-hmm.
So why the focus on visual media, I suppose, in your writing?
Yes, like a lot of folks growing up in the 1980s, 1990s, my exposure to horror was really, kind of that what I consider to be probably the true golden age of the genre in the 1980s, probably the late 70s up through the early 90s. All sorts of movies, the big franchises, obviously Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street type of stuff, but also like mid-list stuff like Pumpkinhead we were talking about before this started, or big budget stuff like Aliens or Terminator, which they're horror movies. They're action movies, but they're horror movies for sure. So that stuff being everywhere all the time, even though I wasn't allowed to watch most of it because my parents didn't want that rotting my brain. I'm having the last laugh because I actually make money rotting other people's brains now. It's kind of nice. Not much money, but I having an exposure to horror on television and on film, and it just being a very powerful, attractive force that I mostly interfaced with through the visual media, right? And of course that changed as I got into books like Goosebumps, R.L. Stine or Christopher Pike, or whatever kiddie ghost story collections that the library had. But I never stopped. I always loved horror movies, even before I was actually allowed to watch most of them. And I've continued to love them, and I've continued to really admire how sight and sound can sort of embed itself in your brain in a way that I'm trying to replicate with literature. And I don't want to say, oh, I'm writing it like a movie, but because I'm a bit of a hack, often my narrative understanding, internal understanding of a narrative is sort of cinematic. So that is naturally going to be translated, both in a sort of subtle way and also in a more overt way when I say, actually, this is something you're watching, or this is something that was a movie, but there's more to it than it just being just a movie. And I've always been fascinated with the blurring of lines between the fiction that you're presented on a screen, what you experience, and how those images, those sights and sounds can sort of like colonize your parts of your mind, right, in a certain way. So whenever something is playing with the line between the real, which is where I live in the real world, insert laugh track here, and then the horror movie that's playing out on screen. If we can blur the lines or maybe even flip them around, I think that's a fascinating idea, and I keep going back to that as an idea, especially with found footage stuff. Most found footage is garbage. It's not good. Most of it's terrible. It's usually just an excuse because they didn't have a lot of money, and you can forgive the bad acting because you sort of expect it, or the plot holes, and because we'll just throw in someone running in a field and shaking a camera around, while someone in a rubber monster mask chases them or something. Most found footage movies are bad, but those that are good are very good, and they tend to stick with me, and they tend to scare me in a way that a traditional horror movie doesn't in most sense. Because in a traditional horror movie, we have the camera over here, and then what's happening that's scary is over there, right? I'm looking at it, but I'm separated from it. Good found footage, metatextual stuff, epistolary stuff, going all the way back to like Bram Stoker's Dracula, being a found footage novel, more or less.
Yeah.
That stuff, it presents itself as real. These are real documents. These are real images that you're seeing. So even if all the scares don't work, if some of them do, they're more effective because a piece of your brain is being willingly tricked into accepting it as possibly being real. So I keep going back to that well, and I'm not sure when I'm going to stop.
Well, I will say Hunting Them Hills and The Crypt of Blood feel less like reading something and more like watching something. Mm-hmm. And they are incredibly effectively creepy.
Thank you.
Now, since Camp Ghoul Mountain is a novelization, mm-hmm. It didn't have quite that feel. But now, when you were writing that, was it always meant to be that metatextual? Was it ever, at any point, just going to be the novelization of a slasher movie that, doesn't exist?
Yeah. So I live in the state of Colorado, and weed's legal here. Okay. So I find that to be useful sometimes. And I think I was watching, I want to say Friday the 13th Part 5 maybe or something, which is a film I actually like quite a bit. But I was like, okay, I love slasher movies. Again, just like found footage, most of them are trash. I acknowledge that. I'll be the first one to tell you that most of them are trash. But I really love them anyway. And I was thinking, is like, okay, I should write a slasher. Slasher movies are horror to me because my horror pantheon wasn't Bela Lugosi, it wasn't Boris Karloff, it was Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers and those Pinhead, like those guys were. Although Pinhead's less of a slasher, but he kind of gets lumped in with them sometimes. But Scream coming out when I was in middle school, I think. So that's like a really formative horror movie for me. That being a meta movie itself, picking up sort of where Wes Craven's New Nightmare left off and just running all the way down the field with that ball, that idea, that trying to blur the line between fiction and reality, and being self-referential. So I had those ideas swimming around in my head, and I was thinking, okay, I want to write a slasher. How do you write a slasher when they've already gone to meta and back again? I love Scream to death. Scream resurrected the slasher movie, but it also killed it. Because it's like, okay, we're going to do the self-referential thing. We'll do the metatextual thing. Where do you go from there? You just keep doing that over and over again? And I think the sequels, especially Scream 4, actually succeeds quite a bit. But without getting in a tangent on that stuff, you can succeed to a more or less degree, but like you're still just kind of iterating on the same idea. So I said, well, what can I do to make a slasher narrative more unique? And I started thinking through slasher movies, my love for 80s horror cinema, because I'm a cliche, I'm a white guy in his 30s, he loves 80s horror, classic cinema. How do I bring that stuff, and going back to the conspiracy theory conversation about what was in the air in the 1980s and the 1990s, what was going on with what the government was doing at places like Ruby Ridge, or the FBI, was it ATF, the Justice Department assault on the Branch Davidian compound, stuff like that, like really scary stuff. The first Iraq War, there was a lot of really scary stuff going on that was feeding distrust of government, distrust of institutions. There was also this idea of UFOs being big, obviously, with Strieber's book kind of entering the cultural zeitgeist. X-Files becoming a big show. Let me take all of this stuff and just bring it all together and see if it works. And I'll write it as a novelization and a behind-the-scenes look of a very weird, idiosyncratic film made by an auteur, self-styled auteur director who's smoking too much weed, taking too many magic mushrooms, and is convinced that the government's out to get him. And he's going to film his movie specifically at the site of a famous alien abduction and just see what happens. And when I was writing it, to be honest, I wasn't sure it was going to work. And I basically approached Ben Holzapfel, who ended up editing the book and did a fantastic job getting that cover together and everything. And I said, I don't know if this works, man. Like you're the first person to read this. I think my wife had read maybe some of it. I said, tell me, does this work? Because I'm afraid we're going to put this out there and no one's going to know what to make of it. So that's kind of the long road of how I ended up coming up with the concept for the book. It was never some grand plan or I'm going to be so clever. It's like, let me take all of these ideas that seem like they're contradictory and mash them together and see how they turn out. And I'm very, very happy with the result personally. So
I thought it was fantastic. I love the footnotes and things that make it feel like there's a director's or a cast crew commentary.
Yep.
You're getting that stuff. And I believe I said in my review that you could just read the chapters that are the movie.
Yep.
And have a great story, a great read.
Yeah.
But it's all the other stuff that elevates it.
Mm-hmm. And
was it weird putting yourself into it?
Yeah, so that's the decision I second guess the most out of the book, because it seems like it's pretty it's a move few people can do and get away with. Stephen King can put himself in the Dark Tower series because he's Stephen King. No one's going to tell him no. Is that the right decision? I don't know, but he can do it. I'm not him. But as I was writing it, and again with all these ideas, I said, swirling around in my head, I said, well, how does it make sense that this is a book at all? How does this make sense that an author, the authorial voice, has this information? Who is the person communicating this information? What are the forces communicating this information? What is the motivation behind that? So as I was thinking through that, I realized it's like, okay, I need to have an author voice because it's going to be the story of the movie, the creepy behind the scenes stuff, and what's happening to the person actually writing writing about all this, because there's consequences for staring into the abyss, which is what the author character is doing when he's putting the book together. And it just seemed easiest to make it a version of me. That's not actually me. That's a character that's named Jonathan Raab. I realized I needed that character to exist to help tell the story. And there's also a good deal, and I've mentioned him a couple times now, John Keel being a paranormal researcher who would talk about what he experienced in Point Pleasant while investigating the Mothman, right? Like him being there around the high strange events, those events responding to him responding to them. That was just as much a part of the story as anything else. So it's a little self-indulgent. I'll be the first to tell you that. But it's a decision I sometimes think about, but I'm ultimately happy I went with it, and I just kind of have to let it be. I think.
I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
I loved the, for lack of a better term, contract negotiations between the author and the publisher, the studio,
the rights holder. Yeah.
All right. I don't want to keep you too long. So do you want to pimp your new book?
Absolutely. I would hold it up again, but it's not going to show up with the screen. It's called The Secret Goatman Spook Show and Other Psychological Warfare Operations. It's my first short story collection. I think it's 15 to 18. I think it's like 18 stories. A few of them are flash fiction. About 3/4 of it has been published in various places. And then I've got about, I think, a quarter of it to a third of it's new material as well. So even if you've read all my stuff, this is where to go. And it concerns all of these themes that we've been discussing tonight. So if I've bored you to tears and turned you off from my fiction forever, you're not going to like the book. But if anything I talked about tonight interests you, this book is full of a couple found footage things, metatextual things, and also just some straight horror stories where I'm just telling a more traditional narrative where some very untraditional things happen. And that's going to be coming out from Turn to Ash. Ben Holzapfel is my editor again. He published the last novel. It's up for pre-order right now. If you grab it now, it'll be numbered and signed, and then it'll probably be available widely, early this summer. But you can actually pre-order it now, I think, at turntoash.com. And let me just pull that up and confirm
that was really quick.
Let me just make sure. Wait time. There it is. Yep, turntoash.com. We'll have a link there. And you can pre-order the book, and I will sign it. And if you want, I can scroll in a personalized rando conspiracy theory or ufological event that may or may not be real. Just put that in the special instructions when you order the book, and I'll make sure I do something for you.
All right. I'll hopefully have a link for that in the description when I post this on YouTube.
Okay.
And so where can people find you on social media?
Mostly, so I do have an Instagram account. You can find Muzzleland Press, which is my small press page on Facebook, or muzzlelandpress.com is the website. Anytime I've got something coming out, I'll usually post there just to catch everybody. I'm most active on Twitter, where, as we discussed previously, I often shitpost about Star Wars. Currently, I'm on a Dark Souls Bloodborne kick. So that's pretty much all I'm posting right now. But any news or upcoming stories or anything like that, or things that I find interesting, I talk about movies sometimes or whatever, you can find me there. You can at me, reach out to me there. I'll try to get back to you. But I mostly just do it for laughs. Don't take it too seriously. So.
All right. I'll try to have links for all that stuff in the description there. All right. So I'm going to do my outro here. And if you could just hang out for a second once we stop recording. Thank you very much for doing this. And to you viewers, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. This has been the Low Budget Interview Show. I'm Eric Smith, and until next time, read more books. And